The wanderers moved across the pale desert, their feet sinking slightly into the fine sand that shifted with every breath of wind, carrying the warmth of a sun that hung low and orange over the endless horizon, stretching farther than the eye could trace. The air trembled with heat and dryness, carrying the faint scent of earth and stone baked under an unyielding sky, and the soft rustle of sand along their legs sounded like a whisper from a world that remembered only the slow passage of time. Each step left an imprint that the wind claimed almost immediately, erasing footprints and smoothing the dunes into a seamless sea. And the wanderers seemed aware of this impermanence, moving without urgency, guided by a rhythm older than memory itself. Their water-skins, heavy at their sides, smelled faintly of resin and earth, while the leather straps warmed against their shoulders. And the texture, of course, cloth and sun-dried hides, marked their bodies with quiet evidence of survival and long travel. The sun leaned toward the horizon, scattering gold across the pale sand, and the light bent over the dunes like a soft sigh, reflecting off grains that sparkled faintly, as if the desert itself carried secret memories beneath its surface. A small group paused near a shallow hollow where the wind softened, and the air smelled faintly of distant minerals and the faint, lingering salt of long-vanished water, while fingers traced the cool ridges of sand that held the memory of countless fleeting footprints. Their hands, calloused and steady, adjusted bundles of dried food and sharpened sticks, while their eyes traced the horizon, following invisible lines and landmarks shaped by wind, sun, and the faint shadows that hinted at hidden hollows and rocks. The breeze carried distant sounds, soft and unformed, like the sigh of the desert itself, and the wanderers breathed it in, letting the dry air scratch gently at their throats, while dust lifted in faint swirls around their moving shapes. Each step was measured, a slow negotiation with the terrain, their feet sinking and shifting in the sand as though it were a living thing, each grain yielding to pressure and then settling again, a soft resistance that shaped the wanderers' pace and attention. The sun climbed higher, turning the horizon a bright pale gold, and the light fell across their furs and cloth, warming shoulders and backs, while shadows stretched faintly along the dunes, offering small relief from the intensity of the open sky. They paused beside a small stone ridge where the sand had gathered against its base, tracing its rough edges with hands that knew the quiet language of texture, feeling the warmth retained from the sun and the coolness beneath its shadow as if reading the day itself. A hawk drifted above, wings wide and deliberate, and the wanderers observed the silent glide of its body, noting the ease with which it cut through the heat, a silent lesson in patience and motion carried on the currents of the air. The youngest among them brushed dust from her hair, the particles catching the sunlight and floating away on the faint breeze. And the wanderers noticed, quietly observing the fragile dance of wind and sand against skin and cloth, a reminder of how ephemeral presence could be. Their mouths tasted faint salt from sweat and dust, and their tongues pressed against dry lips, while the faint crunch of sand beneath their feet and the distant whisper of wind through hollows became a steady, hypnotic rhythm guiding them forward. Evening approached slowly, spreading orange and pink across the dunes, and the light settled like a soft veil over their shoulders, highlighting the textures of worn leather, the roughness of cloth, and the subtle glint of stone tools carried at their sides. A child among the wanderers leaned against a larger figure, the soft weight of small arms marking a moment of trust, while the older travelers adjusted their burdens and watched the sky deepen, knowing the desert would cool rapidly once the sun disappeared. They built a small fire in a shallow hollow, arranging stones and dry twigs with careful hands, the crackle and warmth bringing a quiet comfort against the encroaching chill, while smoke spiraled upward, carrying the faint scent of wood and the desert's dry air mingled together. They ate slowly, tasting dried meat and bread that carried the faint aroma of fire from the previous evening, and each bite became a meditation on sustenance, survival, and the soft intimacy of shared labor beneath a vast and empty sky. The wind rose again, carrying tiny grains of sand that brushed faces and hands, leaving a trace of the day's heat and movement, and the wanderers watched the horizon, seeing nothing but the slow curves of dunes fading into the distance, timeless and unclaimed. Shadows stretched long across the sand, merging with the cooling dusk, and the wanderers' faces glowed in the warm light of the fire, highlighting fine lines and soft eyes that had learned to read the desert without words, sensing its rhythm with quiet awareness. Night came gently, the sky darkening into deep violet and scattered stars appearing like scattered embers above, and the desert grew cold, its chill creeping into bones and cloth, while the fire's glow held a small circle of warmth, life, and memory. The wanderers lay close to the fire, some resting on soft mats of hide, others pressing furs around shoulders and knees, listening to the wind's low sigh and the faint, shifting sound of sand moving across distant dunes like a whispered lullaby. The child curled against a larger figure, eyes heavy, and the adults watched briefly before closing their own, letting sleep arrive in slow waves while the desert exhaled around them, preserving the traces of the day and erasing footprints as if they had never been. The night air smelled faintly of minerals and cooling stone, carrying whispers of distant, unseen life, and the wanderers dreamed lightly, their breathing soft bodies pressed against the warmth of shared presence, while the desert hummed quietly beneath the eternal stars. Before dawn, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, and the wanderers stirred slowly, stretching limbs stiff from night and cold, feeling the sand's texture beneath hands and feet, tasting the first hint of warmth as the sun began to rise beyond the distant dunes. They gathered their small belongings, adjusted their packs, and stepped forward again into the soft glow of morning, leaving behind only traces that the wind would claim, their movement a quiet testament to resilience, memory, and the gentle persistence of wandering across the endless desert. The wanderers moved through the frost-lined plains, their breath rising in thin clouds that mingled with the chill air, while the low sun brushed the snow with pale gold, and their boots left prints that filled quickly with drifting powder. A distant herd moved slowly across the white expanse, their dark forms outlined against the glimmering horizon, and the wanderers followed with quiet patience, reading the rhythm of hooves in snow, the faint scent of musk carried by the wind, and the soft rumble of distant movement. The air smelled faintly of pine and frozen earth, and every inhalation carried a crisp bite that nipped cheeks and noses, while the wanderers adjusted furs and scarves against the cold that seeped through even the thickest hides. Their hands traced the rough edges of carved staffs and leather straps, gripping them for warmth and guidance, while eyes scanned the horizon, noting the rise and fall of snowdrifts and the subtle changes in color where the herd's shadow brushed the land. The wind lifted dry snow in tiny spirals, brushing across the wanderers' faces like whispered reminders of the season, while the crunch of frozen ground beneath their feet formed a quiet, repetitive rhythm that echoed across the wide, empty plains. Sunlight reflected off the ice-crusted grasses, sparkling like scattered gems, and the wanderers paused occasionally to examine frozen tufts, testing their strength beneath boots and fingers, sensing the hidden life preserved beneath frost and the faint promise of growth beneath winter's pause. The youngest among them stumbled once, and the taller figures adjusted their steps, offering quiet support and steadying hands, while the child's breath misted in the air, mingling with the faint scent of smoke from a distant fire that carried warmth and comfort across the frozen plain. The herd shifted and moved ahead, their rhythm deliberate, bodies steaming lightly in the frigid air, and the wanderers followed with care, adjusting pace to match the soft cadence of hooves against ice and snow, their ears tuned to every faint sound in the wide, empty world. At midday, they paused near a shallow river frozen at its edges, the ice glittering in pale sunlight, and the wanderers knelt to taste the cold water beneath, letting it slide over fingers and lips, a brief reminder of life beneath the stillness of winter. The air smelled faintly of thawing earth along the riverbank, and the wanderers felt the subtle difference in temperature against cheeks and hands, noticing the slow drip of melting snow along branches, the occasional crack of ice giving voice to the hidden current beneath. Birds called faintly from distant trees, their voices bright against the whiteness, and the wanderers watched as a single crow swept overhead, casting a moving shadow that glided across snow and ice, a fleeting companion in the wide expanse of solitude. They moved again, following the herd along faint trails pressed into snow by earlier passages, feeling the texture of frozen ground underfoot, the resistance of icy patches beneath boots, and the softness of drifted snow that shifted with every careful step. The sun leaned westward, and the light softened to pale amber, turning snowdrifts into rolling hills of gold and white, while shadows lengthened and the wanderers adjusted furs and cloaks to retain warmth, sensing the slow descent of cold as the day aged toward evening. Occasionally, they stopped to check the path or lift their gaze to the herd, noting the way animals shifted their weight or raised their heads, and the wanderers mirrored their quiet, deliberate attention, moving in harmony with the rhythm of life across the frozen plains. The youngest child reached out to touch snow-laden grasses, leaving faint indentations that the wind began to erase, and the adults watched silently, their fingers tracing the texture of bark and ice-crusted twigs, reading the landscape like an open, living manuscript of winter. The wind carried a faint metallic temps from frozen streams, mingling with pine and the musky scent of the herd, and the wanderers adjusted their breathing to the cold, inhaling slowly, savoring the sharp freshness while feeling it prick the skin and sting the cheeks. As dusk approached, the sky deepened to pale violet and soft rose, and the herd slowed, animals huddling together while the wanderers mirrored the pause, crouching or resting on furs and blankets, feeling the cold seep into fingers and toes, and drawing warmth from shared presence. A small fire was built from driftwood and dried branches, the crackles sending warmth across frozen limbs, while smoke rose in pale spirals, carrying the scent of pine, resin, and earth into the quiet air. the wanderers' faces glowing faintly in firelight against the deepening dusk. They ate slowly, tasting dried meat and nuts, feeling textures rough and smooth against their teeth and tongue. The warmth of the fire spreading through bodies chilled from the day, while their eyes traced distant shadows across snow, reflecting the quiet persistence of the herd's slow journey. The child leaned against an adult, hair dusted with fine snow, and the wanderers observed quietly, sensing the intimacy of shared presence, the comfort of small warmths in cold air, and the rhythm of breathing that linked body to body beneath the wide sky. Night fell gradually, scattering stars across violet and indigo, and the wanderers lay near the fire, listening to the wind ripple through snowdrifts, the subtle murmur of ice and water beneath, and the soft shifting of the herd's forms as it moved slowly in the distance. The cold deepened, carrying scents of frost and distant earth, and the wanderers pulled furs closer, feeling the rough textures of hides against skin, the warmth of the fire at their center, and the gentle weight of sleep beginning to draw eyes closed. Their breaths rose in soft clouds that mingled with smoke, and the subtle sound of exhalation became a quiet chorus, blending with distant murmurs of the herd, the rustle of snow, and the faint whispers of wind, forming a lullaby older than memory itself. When sleep fully arrived, the wanderers rested with limbs tucked close, furs wrapped tightly, and the youngest child nestled at the center, carrying warmth and weight, while above, the stars continued their slow, silent course across the wide, unbroken sky. In the early hours before dawn, the embers of the fire glowed faintly, and the wanderers stirred, stretching stiffened limbs, feeling textures of snow, ice, and frozen grasses beneath hands and feet, tasting the crisp air that promised another day of quiet motion through the vast frozen plains. They rose together, gathering small belongings and adjusting furs and packs, following the herd with measured steps, leaving traces that wind and snow would claim, moving onward in quiet persistence, guided by instinct, observation, and the gentle rhythm of life across the winter landscape. The wanderers approached the river at dawn, its surface still and glassy, reflecting pale light across smooth stones and reeds, and the air carried the faint scent of wet earth mingled with the cold temps of flowing water beneath thin sheets of ice. Their boots sank slightly into soft mud along the bank, leaving impressions that would vanish with the river's next breath, and their hands brushed against mossy stones and damp reeds, feeling textures cold and yielding beneath fingers shaped by years of travel and care. The water moved slowly, its low murmur rising in delicate tones that echoed softly over the banks, and the wanderers knelt to cup it in hands, feeling the smooth flow slip between fingers and carry the chill into their skin. Sunlight pierced the morning mist in scattered ribbons, glinting off ripples and wet leaves, warming the wanderers' shoulders and illuminating their quiet concentration as they inspected the river, tracing its curves with eyes that read patterns older than memory. They gathered long reeds and pliant branches, their hands steady and deliberate, testing each piece for strength and flexibility, while the faint scent of resin and earth clung to palms and fingertips, marking the day with tactile proof of labor and intention. The youngest crouched beside the stream, pressing fingers into soft mud and leaving small prints that vanished with each ripple, while the others shaped bundles of reeds into crude vessels, bending, twisting, and tying them with cordage made of woven grasses and sinew. A heron lifted slowly from the opposite bank, wings extended in silent grace, and the wanderers watched, noting the effortless glide above the moving water, its shadow drifting like a quiet signal across stones, ice, and reeds, a lesson in patience carried by air itself. The river widened and deepened, revealing hidden currents beneath thin ice, and the wanderers traced its edges with careful steps, feeling the subtle difference in texture between mud, stone, and shallow water, sensing the river's pulse beneath their boots, as though it were a living guide. They slid small, roughly bound rafts into the water, each one floating easily against the gentle current, and the wanderers' hands adjusted weight and balance, testing the vessel's responsiveness, while the cold water clung to wood and fingers with subtle persistence. The sun climbed higher, reflecting off the water in liquid gold, and the wanderers paused, inhaling deeply the scents of wet stone, damp leaves, and faint smoke from distant fires, letting warmth seep into cold skin and muscles stiffened from kneeling on riverbanks. The sound of moving water mingled with distant bird calls, the rustle of reeds, and the soft crackle of sticks drying in morning sun, forming a gentle chorus that accompanied the wanderers' labor, each movement precise and flowing in quiet harmony with the environment. They tested each raft, shifting weight gently and adjusting the shape of reeds with experienced hands, noticing subtle differences in buoyancy and texture. And the air carried a faint, earthy aroma as the vessels absorbed water and settled into the river's current. A soft wind blew across the river, lifting reeds, hair, and loose fibers of rope, and the wanderers paused to observe the patterns in movement, sensing that the river and the air were teaching a silent lesson in balance, flow, and the patience required to travel without haste. The youngest observed a small fish glinting beneath the water's surface, scales flashing in the morning light, and the wanderers smiled quietly, noting the quiet presence of life beneath the current and the fragile ecosystem that had endured uncounted seasons before their arrival. Hands pressed against wet wood and cordage, the wanderers moved with deliberation, their fingers tracing knots, bends, and splits, feeling textures that spoke of care and endurance. And the river whispered beneath them, carrying the memory of every hand that had ever shaped vessels along its banks. Sunlight softened as clouds drifted above, casting shifting shadows across the river. And the wanderers paused to watch the interplay of light and reflection, noticing the way it danced across ice, stones, and water, echoing patterns of movement that were mirrored in the bodies of birds and fish. They adjusted furs and garments against the chill, the scent of wet wool rising with each movement, and the quiet sounds of breath, flowing water, and soft scraping of feet against mud became a meditative rhythm, marking the passage of time in subtle, gentle increments. The river bent around a small rise, revealing a shallow pool where sunlight penetrated clear water, and the wanderers knelt to examine it, dipping fingers into the cool depth, feeling smooth pebbles beneath, and listening to the low hum of water moving beneath ice and stone alike. A crow flew overhead, its shadow gliding across the water, and the wanderers noted its passage without interruption, sensing the continuity of life along the river, the interplay of air, water, and land. They worked together to steady rafts, gently placing bundles of reeds onto floating surfaces, adjusting for balance, and letting the current test the vessel's resilience and the tactile sensation of wet wood. Rope and smooth stones filled their senses with subtle reassurance. The youngest brushed fingertips along reeds, noticing their flexibility and the way they yielded to pressure, and the wanderers smiled quietly, seeing the child's awareness deepen, a gentle observation of texture, weight, and water's movement, carrying quiet lessons of patience and care. The afternoon sun warmed their shoulders, highlighting textures of furs, woven cordage, and wet reeds, while shadows lengthened along the riverbank, and the wanderers paused occasionally to inhale the faint sweetness of mud, moss, and the slow warmth of sunlight on cold skin. They pushed rafts gently into the river, feeling the subtle tug of the current and adjusting by tilting, pressing, or balancing with hands that had learned through years to negotiate the quiet negotiation between wood, water, and weight. The river whispered along its hidden channels, carrying the sound of moving water over stone and submerged roots. And the wanderers listened as if it were a story in itself, one told without words, a reflection of patience and continuity flowing through time and memory. Evening approached, soft and pale, turning reflections on the water into copper and rose, and the wanderers settled beside the riverbank, arranging furs and stones to create small hearths, letting warmth spread across bodies chilled from hours of careful labor and attention. They ate slowly, tasting dried fish, berries, and nuts, savoring the textures and scents of each, the gentle warmth of fire rising and mingling with the river's cold breath, while their eyes traced distant water and shadows, reflecting on movement, rhythm, and the quiet pulse of life. The child leaned against a larger figure, body warm and eyes heavy, while the older wanderers watched with quiet patience, feeling the rhythm of breath and heartbeats, the tactile weight of furs and blankets, and the comfort of shared presence in the fading light. Night deepened slowly, scattering stars across a wide sky reflected in the river's surface, and the wanderers rested near fire embers, listening to water, wind, and distant movements of reeds, the textures and sounds of the day dissolving into memory, while the river continued its unbroken journey. When the fire dimmed to glowing coals, the wanderers stirred at the first hints of dawn, stretching stiffened limbs, feeling the cool touch of stones and wet grass beneath hands and feet, tasting the crisp river air that promised another day of quiet work and slow motion along its banks. They gathered rafts, secured supplies, and adjusted furs before stepping forward into the soft light, leaving only faint impressions that the river and wind would reclaim. Moving together along the water's edge with quiet determination, guided by instinct, observation, and the gentle continuity of flowing life. The wanderers entered the forest as a gentle mist lingered among towering trunks, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and moss, and every step pressed against soft, uneven soil that whispered beneath boots and bare feet alike. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in scattered shafts of gold, falling across ferns, leaves, and fallen branches, warming shoulders and hands with a quiet glow, while shadows danced gently over bark, revealing textures rough, grooved, and softened by centuries of rain and wind. Their fingers brushed along trunks, tracing knots, ridges, and hidden hollows, feeling the subtle vibration of life within, and the wanderers moved slowly, as if reading a silent language written in bark, leaf, and the faint hum of unseen creatures. The undergrowth rustled with hidden life, leaves and ferns shivering as small animals scurried unseen, and the wanderers paused to listen, feeling the pulse of movement in the earth, hearing faint snaps of twigs beneath delicate paws, that carried the forest's quiet rhythm. They stepped carefully over moss-covered roots, the spongy green cool beneath their fingers, and the wanderers inhaled deeply, drawing in the scents of wet soil, pine resin, and the faint sweetness of decay turning slowly to nourishment for growth beneath their feet. A shallow stream wound through the trees, its surface catching fragments of sunlight and rippling with cool clarity, and the wanderers knelt beside it, cupping water in hands to feel the gentle flow slip over fingers, tasting the chill and freshness as a reminder of life's persistence. The soft scent of wildflowers lingered in patches along the banks, faint and delicate, and the wanderers observed petals brushed by passing breeze, noting their subtle textures, colors, and shapes, while the moss and leaf litter provided a tactile backdrop that grounded their senses in the present. Birdsong rose intermittently from the canopy, clear, delicate, and unhurried, and the wanderers tilted heads to listen, following the melody as it traced invisible paths across branches and trunks, understanding that life here moved slowly, deliberately, and in harmonious rhythm with the forest itself. Sunlight shifted as clouds passed, creating moving patterns on ferns and moss, and the wanderers paused to feel the warmth and shadow alternate across their skin, noticing the contrast between the dry heat of light and the cool softness of shaded soil beneath hands and knees. They discovered a fallen log, its surface thick with moss and fungi, and pressed fingers into its damp texture, noting the softness of decay, the faint aroma of wood returning to earth, and the tiny resilience of life clinging to its surface despite years of weathering. The youngest crouched beside a clump of moss, brushing it gently between fingers, while the elders watched silently, sensing the child's tactile learning and quiet wonder, and feeling the continuity of curiosity and observation that had guided countless wanderers before them. A small deer moved gracefully through filtered light, ears twitching, hooves silent against moss and leaf litter, and the wanderers observed, noting the subtle rhythm of its body, the sheen of fur in sunlight, and the careful awareness that marked all creatures of the forest. They followed the stream for hours, stepping lightly on stones and through shallow pools, feeling textures shift beneath feet, smooth, jagged, soft, and yielding, and the cool water seeped through boots and fur, leaving traces of chill and gentle vibration against skin. The air carried a faint metallic temps from wet stones, the earthy scent of leaves, and the subtle aroma of growing shoots, and the wanderers inhaled deeply, letting each fragrance fill senses while anchoring memory to place, body, and the quiet passage of time. Sunlight began to fade toward afternoon, turning leaves golden, amber, and pale green, and the wanderers adjusted furs and cloaks to retain warmth, noticing how shadows lengthened and intertwined with trunks, creating a soft lattice that moved as the day shifted slowly across the sky. They paused at a natural clearing where sunlight pooled, kneeling to examine small insects, leaf veins, and the intricate patterns of bark and stone, touching textures with care, listening to the faint hum of life, and understanding that observation here required patience, stillness, and reverence. Hands pressed against cold water and wet leaves, the wanderers felt the delicate give of soil beneath, the resistance of moss, and the subtle vibration of tiny movements in the undergrowth, learning through touch as much as through sight, and letting their attention dissolve into the quiet world around them. Birds rose and fell across the clearing, their flight soft and unhurried, and the wanderers noted each arc and flutter, sensing the rhythm of air currents and observing how the forest guided movement, teaching subtle lessons about weight, balance, and the invisible network of life that supported them all. The child leaned against a larger figure, tracing the edge of a fern with small fingers, and the elders observed in quiet awareness, feeling the gentle exchange of warmth, touch, and shared attention, an unspoken bond that mirrored the forest's own interwoven life. The sun lowered further, scattering warm gold across the moss, ferns, and stones, and the wanderers paused to taste water from the stream, feeling the cool flow wash across hands and lips, carrying with it the faint mineral scent of earth and the subtle memory of seasons past. A soft breeze rose, lifting hair and leaves in gentle eddies, and the wanderers felt it across skin and clothing, noticing the way it shifted temperature and texture, a delicate reminder that the forest was alive in unseen currents as much as in the forms of creatures and trees. They gathered small branches and dry moss for a fire, the tactile resistance of wood and pliancy of moss grounding senses in labor, while smoke rose in thin spirals, carrying the faint aroma of resin and earth into the cool air, mingling with scents of damp moss. The fire glowed faintly as evening deepened, warming chilled limbs, and the wanderers arranged themselves nearby, tasting dried food and nuts, feeling textures of soft fur and rough bark beneath hands, and listening to distant rustle of leaves, the stream's murmur, and the hush of a forest settling into night. They rested near the fire's warmth, breathing slowly, inhaling scents of pine, smoke, and damp soil, and the elders watched shadows play across faces, noting the child's heavy eyes and steady breathing, while the forest hummed softly, carrying the memory of every step, sound, and touch of the day. Stars began to appear through gaps in the canopy, pale points of light reflected faintly in water and on wet leaves, and the wanderers felt the vastness of sky above, the quiet presence of the forest around, and the gentle reassurance that life and memory flowed together in delicate, continuous rhythm. As night deepened, the fire burned low, and the wanderers curled into furs, pressing bodies close to retain warmth, listening to wind, water, and the faint stir of nocturnal life, feeling textures of bark, moss, and leaf beneath fingers, and the quiet pulse of being present in an ancient, living world. In the first hours of dawn, the wanderers rose slowly, stretching stiff limbs, tasting the cool air, and feeling the subtle textures of moss, bark, and soil beneath hands and feet, preparing to move again through the endless, unbroken forest that carried them onward with gentle, patient guidance. They gathered supplies, adjusted furs and packs, and stepped forward into morning light, leaving behind only impressions that wind, rain, and forest life would reclaim, moving with quiet determination, guided by instinct, observation, and the soft rhythm of the woodland that had held them through night. The wanderers began their ascent as the morning sun painted the distant peaks in soft apricot light, and the crisp mountain air carried the scent of rock, frost, and sparse alpine vegetation that brushed faintly against their hands. Their boots pressed against loose stones and icy patches, each step deliberate, feeling subtle shifts in texture and temperature beneath soles, while the wind whispered over ridges, stirring hair, clothing, and the faint chill that brushed exposed skin with patient insistence. They paused near a small ledge to observe the valley below, noting the soft glimmer of streams and patches of forest, the pale green of distant mosses, and the shifting shadows cast by rising peaks as light moved gently across the slopes. Hands brushed along granite and lichen, feeling rough, cold surfaces and subtle warmth retained in crevices touched by sun. And the wanderers adjusted their packs, furs, and straps to retain heat while listening to distant bird calls echoing faintly in the wide, echoing space. The air grew thinner as they climbed higher, and each breath drew icy strands of oxygen into lungs, while the faint metallic temps of stone and mineral clung to their nostrils, reminding them of the mountain's ancient permanence and subtle, enduring presence. A small herd of goats appeared across a distant ridge, moving gracefully among jagged stones, and the wanderers watched quietly, noting the fluid rhythm of hooves against rock, the glint of sun on fur, and the balance that allowed them to navigate steep, shifting terrain with ease. Their fingers brushed against snow-dusted boulders and frost-coated shrubs, feeling textures cold, sharp, and soft in varying measures, and the wanderers adjusted posture, pace, and grip, sensing the interplay of weight, resistance, and careful negotiation with each rising incline. Sunlight shifted, casting elongated shadows across ridges and ledges, and the wanderers paused to observe the interplay of light and stone, tracing textures with eyes and fingers while inhaling scents of dry moss, cold rock, and faint alpine flowers hiding in cracks and hollows. The wind rose gently, carrying a subtle whisper of distant snowfields, and the wanderers adjusted hoods and scarves, feeling the soft brush of cloth against skin, the occasional sting of icy droplets, and the persistent reminder of elevation as the air thinned and temperature dropped incrementally. They rested on a sun-warmed ledge, tasting chilled water from small flasks, noting its crispness and smooth flow over lips and tongue, while the warmth of sunlight against shoulders provided contrast to the sharp chill of shaded stone beneath hands and knees. A hawk glided above, wings wide and deliberate, following invisible thermals that rose from sun-warmed rocks, and the wanderers observed quietly, noting the effortless control of flight and the subtle lessons offered by balance, patience, and observation of natural rhythm across wide, open space. Hands gripped carved walking sticks, tracing texture and grain, feeling warmth from sun and subtle cool from shaded areas, and the wanderers moved in measured steps, listening to the crunch of stone, the hiss of shifting gravel, and the soft echo of wind across high ridges. They paused at a narrow pass, inhaling faint scents of ice, stone, and dry earth, while the sun's rays scattered in shards across boulders, illuminating moss and frost in intricate patterns, and each wanderer traced textures with fingers as they adjusted packs and furs to maintain warmth. The youngest ran a hand along rough granite, feeling the tiny grooves and sharp edges beneath fingertips, and the elders observed silently, sensing the child's tactile engagement with the mountain, the quiet learning and awe that accompanied careful, deliberate interaction with such timeless terrain. Sunlight softened toward late afternoon, turning peaks golden and shadows long, and the wanderers paused to taste water from trickling streams, feeling its chill and smoothness, noticing the faint mineral temps, and inhaling scents of moss, damp earth, and alpine flowers hidden among stones. A faint eagle call echoed across the ridges, carrying sound across valleys and ledges, and the wanderers listened attentively, noting subtle shifts in wind and pressure, learning through quiet observation the interplay of movement, air, and life in the high, open space around them. They adjusted furs and scarves against rising chill, feeling textures of wool, leather, and soft inner linings, while the wind lifted dust, ice crystals, and fine gravel, brushing against exposed skin and leaving faint impressions of cold, tactile reminders of the mountain's persistent presence. Each step up narrow paths was deliberate, fingers brushing against rock and ice, feeling subtle shifts in temperature and texture, while the crunch of gravel and snow beneath boots created a soft, measured rhythm that guided body and mind forward in harmony with terrain. The sun lowered, scattering warm copper and amber across peaks and ledges, and the wanderers paused to observe long shadows, adjusting posture and grip, feeling textures of cold rock and dry stone, and inhaling scents of frost, moss, and mineral that marked the slow progress of the day. A snowfield appeared across a high slope, its surface firm yet giving beneath boots, and the wanderers moved carefully, tracing icy ridges with fingers, feeling cold seep into gloves and skin, while the glint of sunlight on ice created fleeting patterns across surfaces touched by wind and movement. They built a small fire in a shallow hollow sheltered by boulders, arranging dry moss and twigs, and the crackle and warmth provided immediate relief, while smoke carried the scent of resin and earth into the thin mountain air, blending with the sharp chill of elevation. They ate slowly, tasting dried meat, nuts, and berries, savoring textures rough, smooth, and sweet, while the warmth of fire spread through frozen fingers and toes, and their eyes traced shifting shadows and reflections on stone, snow, and ice, grounding memory in tactile presence. The child leaned against an elder, feeling warmth and weight, while others observed quietly, listening to wind, distant ice shifts, and faint calls of birds, sensing the quiet continuity of life, breath, and motion at high altitude in the soft, dimming light. Stars began to appear across the pale evening sky, scattered and clear, reflecting faintly on snow and ice, and the wanderers felt the vast openness of the mountains, the cold settling into stone and skin, and the gentle rhythm of bodies breathing in shared presence. The fire dwindled to glowing embers, and the wanderers nestled into furs, pressing limbs close for warmth, listening to faint shifting of snow, occasional distant rocks, and the whispering wind, feeling textures of cloth, fur, and stone beneath fingers and body, absorbing the quiet night. Before first light, they stirred, stretching stiffened limbs and tasting crisp, thin air, feeling subtle textures of frost, stone, and remaining snow beneath hands and feet, preparing once again to ascend higher, guided by careful observation, tactile awareness, and gentle persistence across the cold, eternal mountains. They gathered fire remnants, adjusted packs and furs, and began moving along narrow ridges into dawn, leaving faint traces of passage that wind, snow, and time would reclaim, advancing together with quiet determination, guided by instinct, patience, and the enduring, soft rhythm of mountain life. The days grew longer as the wanderers pressed farther into lands where the sky seemed to lean closer to the earth, carrying with it the quiet weight of heat that shimmered above pale stones like breath upon glass. Their feet moved across the earth's uneven skin, where cracked clay broke apart under the sun's slow gaze, and every step released faint whispers of dust that clung to their ankles like memories unwilling to be left behind. The air carried a taste of dryness that settled upon their tongues, a flavor of wind-blown salt and forgotten rivers, as though the land itself remembered a time when water had once ruled these plains, but chose silence over confession. As the day deepened, the horizon blurred into a haze of muted gold, and the wanderers' shadows stretched thin and uncertain, bending over ridges and shallow gullies as though searching for something ahead that might give them shape again. Their skin held the warmth of the sun like a secret too bright to speak aloud, and each movement seemed wrapped in a faint hum of cicadas hidden among dry grasses, the sound rising and falling like a breath too slow to wake. Sometimes they found shallow depressions where wind had gathered brittle stalks and feather-light seeds, the air there cooler and still, carrying the faintest fragrance of roots clinging stubbornly to earth, no longer willing to feed them. The youngest of the wanderers paused often, running fingers through the powdery soil, letting grains slip slowly from their palms, as though the land itself might tell them its stories if held long enough in quiet hands. They saw the faint traces of hooves, in some places sharp-edged and crumbling, the remnants of antelope or gazelle long since gone, leaving only pressed memories in the dirt like signatures fading under the weight of time. Evening came softly, not with the suddenness of storms or the rushing wind of mountain passes, but with the slow unwinding of light as the sun lowered itself carefully, as though fearful of startling the waiting earth. The sky took on the color of cooled embers, soft and deep, and the wanderers gathered near a cluster of rocks where the ground dipped slightly, a hollow shaped by centuries of wind that offered both shelter and stillness. They carried fire with them the way others might carry prayer, striking sparks into dry grasses until flames curled upward in thin orange threads, crackling softly like voices unsure if they should be heard beyond this circle of night. Smoke rose in pale ribbons, carrying the smell of burning roots and desert shrubs, the fragrance weaving itself into their hair and skins until it became part of them, a scent that would follow even after the fire was gone. They ate sparingly, sharing strips of dried meat and handfuls of gathered seeds, their movements slow and unhurried, as though hunger itself had grown accustomed to waiting patiently within their ribs for whatever the land might offer next. The stars revealed themselves gradually, as though shy of the dark at first, then gathering courage until the sky was freckled with their silent congregation, each one carrying a faint pulse of light, like breath drawn too softly to hear. The wanderers leaned back upon cool stones, eyes following the old patterns above them, shapes told by generations before in words now lost, leaving only the faint sense that the heavens themselves remembered what humans had forgotten. Night winds moved through the hollow with the coolness of distant snowmelt, though no rivers lay near, brushing against their skins with fingers so light it seemed the air feared to wake those already drifting toward sleep. They dreamed as the fire dwindled, its embers collapsing inward with faint sighs, the warmth sinking slowly into the earth until only faint glows marked where day had once held its last vigil against the rising dark. In their dreams came images of water running between green banks, of birds lifting from reeds in sudden gusts of wings, of rains falling not in storms but in long patient curtains over thirsty lands now scattered into dust. The night deepened, carrying the scents of cooling stones and distant sage, wrapping the wanderers in air that smelled faintly of iron and forgotten rain, as though promising something the dawn itself might never be able to give. When morning finally touched the horizon, it did so with the gentleness of water slipping over smooth stones, light spreading without hurry, carrying with it the faint warmth of renewal as the wanderers rose once more in silence. They left behind the ashes of their fire, gray and fragile against the earth's cracked surface, the wind already reaching to scatter them, erasing the faint memory of warmth before the day could fully begin. Their path bent toward the east, where faint hills wavered in the distance, each rise softened by haze, until they seemed less like stone and more like the slow breathing of the earth beneath the widening sky. Bird calls drifted from somewhere unseen, thin and clear, carrying across the air like threads of sound too fine to touch, weaving briefly through the morning before vanishing again into distances too large for the eye to follow. The land here smelled of warming sand and crushed leaves, where dry shrubs clung low to the earth, releasing faint fragrances beneath their feet, as if the ground itself exhaled beneath each careful step forward. They moved together, yet spoke little, their silence carrying no weight of sorrow, but rather the quietness of those who have learned that words fall quickly in places where winds erase even the sharpest footprints overnight. By midday the heat had gathered again above the plains, draping itself over the land like a heavy cloth, and the wanderers walked within its shimmering folds as though moving through the slowed breath of some sleeping giant. Their bodies glistened with sweat that tasted of salt and dust, drying quickly under the sun's stillness, leaving faint traces upon their skins like maps charting the distances carried beneath this pale and endless sky. They found shade only rarely, the sparse trees offering slivers of darkness that fell across their shoulders like blessings too thin to last, and yet they paused in each one as though such brief shelter might teach them gratitude again. The air held the dry sweetness of thorn flowers blooming close to the ground, small pale things that clung to life stubbornly, their fragrance drifting upward in defiance of the sun's long, unbroken reign across the open sky. Later, as evening returned with its cooling breath, the wanderers found another hollow in the earth, where stones rose like low walls, and again they struck fire. Again they gathered beneath stars, spilling their quiet silver across the dark. Here they rested, and here the wind moved among them like an old companion, stirring hair and cooling skin, carrying with it the faint promise of rivers far beyond this land of dust and patient silence. Morning came with a breath of wind that felt cooler than the day before, carrying the scent of distant rains, though no clouds, yet touched the long pale horizon where the sky unrolled in endless silence over the waiting earth. The wanderers rose slowly, their limbs stiff from sleep, upon stones still holding the faint warmth of yesterday's sun, and they moved as though reluctant to break the stillness that clung like thin mist between the soft-breathing hills ahead. Each step carried the whisper of dust rising beneath their feet, curling briefly in small spirals before falling again, as if even the earth itself was too tired to hold the shape of wind for more than a heartbeat. They passed thorn trees leaning at angles shaped by years of wind, their branches creaking softly like old doors opening into forgotten rooms, while birds stirred among them with wings flashing white against the muted browns of the land. The air was rich with the scent of resin, where sap clung to split bark, the sweetness sharp and dry together, rising toward the sun in thin threads that tangled briefly with dust before drifting upward into the sky's wide emptiness. Far off, the earth rippled into ridges where shadows pooled like water in the folds, and the wanderer's eyes followed these shapes, the way one follows stories told in gestures rather than words, reading what the land offered without hurry. Heat gathered slowly as the sun climbed, pressing its long warm fingers across their shoulders until their shadows shrank into dark pools close around their feet, moving with them like silent companions, unwilling to fall too far behind. By midday they came upon the bones of something once alive, scattered pale and clean upon the cracked earth, curved shapes glinting under the sun as if polished by years of wind, carrying sand like quiet, patient knives. The children among them paused, kneeling to trace the smoothness of ribs half buried in drifting soil, their fingertips running along the edges as though touching the memory of the creature itself, something that had once breathed beneath the same sky. No words rose among them, for there was no need. The bones spoke in their silence of rivers gone dry and grasses that no longer swayed in wind, of mouths that had searched for water where only dust remained. The wanderers moved on, leaving the skeleton as they had found it, the wind already beginning to soften their footprints until the earth once again seemed untouched, as though neither bone nor human had ever lingered here at all. Toward evening the land changed, folding inward where low cliffs rose in broken steps of stone, their faces stained with colors the sun drew from minerals buried deep, bands of rust and ochre glowing like embers cooling beneath ash. They followed a narrow path carved by nothing more than centuries of rain and wind, a passage winding between the cliffs where air moved with the faint chill of places. Sunlight touched only briefly before retreating again toward the open sky. Here the ground smelled of dampness held in shadow, the fragrance of stone after rain, even though no water ran across its surface, as if the memory of storms lingered long after the clouds themselves had passed into forgetting. Bird calls echoed faintly from crevices high above, the sound falling in slow fragments between walls where the wind carried it back and forth, before letting it vanish like breath fading against the edges of night. The wanderers found shelter where the cliffs opened into a hollow, half-ringed by boulders, a place shaped by wind into curves that cradled the air so gently it seemed carved for rest long before any human had walked here. They gathered wood carried down from higher ground, branches bleached pale and dry as bone, snapping beneath their hands with sounds sharp against the evening hush before fire coaxed them into flames, moving gold along the hollow's walls. Smoke rose into the cooling air, carrying the bittersweet scent of burning sap that mingled with the dryness of dust and the faint musk of their own worn skins, warmed by the day's long miles under the watching sun. They ate what they had, carried roots gathered from stream beds long left behind, berries dried beneath older fires, thin slices of meat traded in some forgotten place where other wanderers had moved on before them into other distances. The cliffs glowed softly where the firelight touched them, turning stone into walls the color of honey and late summer wheat, while beyond the hollow the sky deepened into a darkness where the first stars trembled faintly above the far ridges. Shadows moved along the rock faces, shaped by the flames' restless gestures, so that the walls themselves seemed to breathe with slow life, holding the firelight the way memory holds faces long after voices have grown too quiet to hear. The wanderers lay upon skins stretched across the earth, the ground beneath them still faintly warm, though the air carried the cool breath of stone that had not seen sunlight since morning first touched its highest edges. A child traced shapes upon the dust beside the fire, drawing lines that curved into spirals and circles. Patterns passed from one generation to the next, though no one remembered where they began or what stories they were meant to hold. The others watched without speaking, eyes following the glowing tip of the stick moving through ash, the fire behind it crackling softly, as though adding its own small voice to a language only the night could fully understand. Above them, the stars gathered in greater numbers until the sky was bright with their frozen sparks. A river of light spilling silently across the dark where no bird flew and no wind reached to disturb its surface. Someone hummed a melody older than words, a tune that rose and fell like breath drawn in sleep, carrying with it the feeling of water running through reeds, though none here had seen such rivers in many seasons. The sound moved among them the way wind moves through grass, touching each face briefly before continuing on, until even the cliffs seemed to listen with their long, eroded ears pressed toward the circle of fire below. Sleep came slowly, curling around them like another blanket spread above skins and cooling stones. The fire's last light painting faint patterns upon eyelids before fading into embers no brighter than the smallest stars overhead. By dawn, the air carried the scent of ash and dew together, sharp and clean at once, as the wanderers rose from their hollow and turned east again. Leaving behind only faint footprints, the wind was already beginning to erase. The cliffs watched them go without expression, holding within their shadows the memory of firelight and song, the echoes of quiet voices drifting upward until even these grew still beneath the widening arms of the coming day. The day began with a hush so deep that even the birds seemed reluctant to break it, their wings folded tightly as if the sky itself had asked for silence before the first colors of morning gathered along the farthest edges of the world. The wanderers walked eastward, where the horizon trembled faintly with pale gold, their shadows stretching long and thin across the earth that still held the cool breath of night, as though the darkness was reluctant to let go of its hold. Wind moved low among the grasses, where dew clung like small glass beads, each blade bending beneath its tiny burden until the first warmth of sun loosened their grip and sent them sliding softly into the soil waiting below. They passed through open land where the air smelled faintly of salt, though no sea lay near, only distant plains cracked by old riverbeds, where water had once carved its restless path before vanishing into seasons to dry for memory to hold. The ground here bore thin crusts of pale mineral that broke gently beneath their feet with the crispness of pottery left too long in the sun, each step sounding softer than the last as dust rose and lingered briefly before settling once more. Their hands brushed against stalks of brittle grass rattling in the wind like faint percussion, a music stitched from earth and air alone, carrying notes that belonged to no one yet wrapped themselves around every listener with equal tenderness, each ridge holding shadows that waited like pools of ink for the sun to arrive. They moved toward those hills without speaking, drawn by a stillness deeper than the silence behind them, as though something within the earth itself was calling softly through stone and root, for their footsteps to follow the old paths once again. By mid-morning, the air thickened with warmth, a slow, golden weight settling across shoulders and backs, until sweat rose gently upon skin, tasting faintly of salt when fingers brushed it away, drying almost instantly beneath the ever-watching sky. Among the hills they found caves carved by nothing but wind and rain, mouths of darkness opening where sunlight could not reach, their entrances rimmed with lichen clinging stubbornly to stone, as if unwilling to release its fragile hold. The first cave smelled of cool earth and the faint musk of animals long gone, its floor patterned with tracks blurred by time, a tapestry of paws and hooves crossing one another like voices murmuring half-forgotten songs in the dark. They rested there through the hottest hours, backs against stone walls, breathing cold from deep within, while the wind outside carried dust in thin veils that swept across the hillsides, before falling back into stillness as though exhausted by its own wandering. Some among them traced the cave's walls, where mineral veins caught the firelight of small flames coaxed from dry twigs, each line of quartz glimmering faintly like frozen rivers captured in rock, unmoving, yet filled with the memory of motion. Others slept where shadows gathered thickest, bodies curled loosely upon the earth, still cool from night, their dreams stirring faintly behind closed eyes, as though shaped by the distant echo of winds, moving across forgotten plains far beyond these hills. When they woke, the air outside had shifted, carrying with it a dryness sharper than before, tinged with the scent of stone warmed through to its core as the sun bent westward, throwing long beams of honey-colored light across the land. They left the cave slowly, as though reluctant to abandon its dark coolness for the brightness waiting beyond, and began moving again through valleys where grass grew taller, brushing softly against their legs with whispers like voices just beyond hearing. Birds circled overhead where thermal winds rose along the slopes, their cries falling thin and distant, shaped by the wide emptiness until each note stretched and faded like threads, pulled slowly from a woven cloth too old to hold together. Near evening they found a stream running shallow between stones polished smooth by centuries of water, passing this way, its surface carrying the reflected sky in trembling fragments broken by each ripple sliding around rocks darkened by its touch. They knelt there, drinking where the water moved clearest, the taste cold and edged faintly with minerals drawn from deep places beneath the hills, each mouthful carrying the feeling of distance traveled, of thirst quieted by something older than themselves. Children filled skins of hide made soft by years of use, their small hands dripping silver trails back into the current where fish flickered briefly, shadows darting between deeper pools before vanishing into the slow rhythm of water over stone. The wanderers stayed beside the stream as night rose softly from the edges of the earth, laying out skins upon grass flattened by wind, while firelight flickered along trunks of stunted trees growing close to the banks like patient sentinels. The smell of smoke mingled with the cool scent of water sliding through reeds, a mingling of earth's voices that drifted into the dark where stars began showing faintly through the last veil of fading gold above the horizon. They ate roots softened in the coals, the sweetness rising with the steam as they broke the charred skins apart, passing them from hand to hand, while the fire painted their faces in warm, shifting colors beneath the wide night sky. Songs followed, low and almost tuneless, the kind shaped more by breath than melody, carrying words older than any memory present, spoken into darkness where only the wind and the slow-moving water seemed to lean close enough to listen. The hills caught those sounds and returned them softly, an echo smoothed by distance, until it seemed the earth itself was singing back. Voice too deep and slow for human ears to hold entirely, yet felt beneath the skin like steady rain. One by one they lay down, eyes turning upward, toward constellations, stepping carefully into view, each star burning with a patience beyond measure, holding its place above lives that passed beneath like brief sparks carried away on wind. Sleep drifted over them with the quiet rhythm of waves they had never seen yet somehow remembered, as though the turning of the earth itself carried the same rocking motion as water lapping endlessly against unseen shores. By dawn, the fire was only ash cooling beside the stream, the trees lifting their branches toward light returning once more, while the wanderers gathered their things and moved on, leaving behind nothing but flattened grass and faint footprints along the bank. The water kept flowing after them, carrying the reflection of sky upon its back, as though it had learned long ago that everything must pass, yet nothing is ever truly lost, only carried forward into other days, other distances. Morning light unfolded gently across the valleys, as though unrolling a sheet of pale gold over the sleeping earth, filling every hollow and ridge with warmth so quiet it seemed almost hesitant to disturb the breath of the fading night. The wanderers moved beneath this slow-growing brightness, where mist still clung in fragile threads along the stream they had left behind, drifting upward in shapes that bent and stretched before dissolving softly into air warming under the sun's steady hand. They walked toward rising land, where the grass grew thinner with each step, replaced by stones dulled by ages of wind passing over them, their surfaces carrying colors worn to softness like cloth washed countless times in cold river water. The air grew drier as the day unfolded, carrying with it the faint scent of dust lifting from paths long unused, a smell both empty and familiar, as though it held the memory of many journeys now lost to time. In places, the ground cracked beneath heat that had gathered there through countless summers, fissures running like thin black veins across pale clay where only wiry shrubs clung stubbornly, their roots buried deep in search of water long withdrawn underground. They moved slowly, not from weariness, but from the weight of the sun pressing down from a sky so wide and bright it seemed to have no edges, only a shimmering haze where earth and air met in silence. Children walked close to their mothers, where shade from carried hides softened the glare, their small feet leaving prints beside those of elders whose steps carried the same shape through decades of travel across lands that never waited for anyone. Occasionally, the wind brought scents from far away, a mingling of wild sage crushed beneath wandering animals, and the faint metallic breath of rain held somewhere beyond the horizon, though no clouds yet marked the blue expanse above them. By midday, the ground rose into broken ridges, where stone outcroppings jutted upward like the spines of creatures sleeping beneath the surface. Their flanks, streaked with colors born from minerals, pulled slowly upward through ages beyond counting. Among these ridges, the wanderers found traces of fire circles left by those who had passed long before them, stones blackened in places where wood had burned down into ash, now scattered thinly by winds traveling through empty seasons. They paused here for food gathered earlier along the valleys, roots wrapped in leaves and dried berries carrying the sweetness of distant thickets, eating in the shadow of rocks that rose like silent companions, listening to the soft murmur of voices. Far below, birds traced slow circles above ridges where warm air climbed skyward. Their wings held steady, as though trusting invisible hands to lift them higher. The sunlight flashing along feathers, shaped by the same wind that touched human faces. When they resumed walking, the path led upward across slopes that crumbled gently underfoot, each step releasing small slides of dust glinting faintly before drifting back into stillness, as though even movement here wished to leave no lasting mark. From the highest ridge they could see land stretching outward in long sweeps of muted color, a tapestry woven from rock, grass, and winding traces of dry riverbeds glimmering faintly where crystals of salt caught the falling sunlight. The air carried a new dryness here, sharper and thinner, pressing coolness into lungs despite the warmth upon their backs, as though height itself brought the breath of distant peaks still hidden beyond many days of walking. They descended slowly along a trail shaped by hooves long vanished, the path curling between slopes where wind had carved narrow channels through stones, leaving walls smoothed and hollowed like the insides of shells once held against the ear. Evening approached as they reached a plateau where grass swayed in low waves beneath the wind, the land opening around them with a sense of distance so vast it seemed to gather the fading daylight into itself. Here they found water once more, a thin spring seeping from beneath layers of rock to form a pool edged with moss glowing faintly green beneath the slanting sun, its surface trembling where the breeze bent low across it. They knelt here to drink, the water tasting of stone and deep places untouched by heat, its coldness carrying upward into faces and hands, as though the earth itself offered a brief kindness, before night settled across the plateau. Fires were lit where dry wood lay scattered among the grasses, smoke lifting in thin blue lines that carried the smell of resin into air turning violet and rose. As the sun withdrew slowly behind distant ridges, they ate in quiet while wind threaded through the tall grass with a sound like water slipping over countless small stones, a music rising and falling without beginning or end beneath the widening field of evening stars. Later, some wandered beyond the circle of firelight, where the ground dipped gently toward valleys silvered by moonlight, their feet brushing softly against seed heads glowing pale, where night's cool breath gathered upon every fragile surface. They stood there listening to the low calls of night creatures moving unseen through grass and stones, voices answering one another across distances filled with darkness yet carrying no sense of fear. Only the steady rhythm of life continuing unseen. The plateau held this stillness like a vessel carved by wind and time, its wide expanse gathering every flicker of flame, every sound of movement, every thread of smoke rising upward until even the sky seemed to pause above it. Sleep came slowly here where the air felt thinner and the stars shone with a brightness sharper than in valleys below, each constellation turning with the earth as though tracing patterns meant for no eyes, yet watching nonetheless. Those who kept the last fires fed listened to wind passing along the ridges, its tone rising and falling with a music older than any song carried by human voices, a music belonging only to stone, air, and endless distance. When dawn finally returned, it came first as a whitening of the highest peaks barely visible to the east, then as a slow flooding of gold across grass, stone, and silent faces lifting once more to begin the day's long path forward. The fires crumbled into ash, left drifting upon wind that would scatter it across the plateau until no trace remained, as though the night itself had taken every warmth and word spoken beside those flames into its keeping. By the time the sun stood clear above the ridges, the wanderers were moving again, leaving behind only bent grasses where they had slept, carrying with them the quietness gathered beneath stars now fading into the brightening sky. The last days of travel unfolded beneath a sky where the sun seemed slower, its light gathering along the edges of clouds, drifting like pale ships across distances too wide for any horizon to contain. The wanderers moved beneath this shifting brightness where earth met air with a softness found only in lands worn by countless seasons, the wind brushing across open grass and through their hair with the touch of something both patient and unending. Footsteps pressed into soil, carrying the faint scent of rain fallen long before, its memory rising from the ground in warmth, released by sunlight, turning the air above the path into a wavering haze of gold and silver. Children no longer asked how far the way might be, their voices fading into the quiet rhythm of walking, as though even questions now belonged to the wind moving beside them, carrying seeds from one meadow into another unseen place. Each evening they found water gathering in hollows, where reeds grew with the slow strength of roots holding to damp soil, the pools reflecting stars with a stillness unbroken even by the night birds circling silently above their own reflections. The fires they built burned smaller here, where the land opened wide beneath the moon, flames rising in thin spirals that left smoke clinging briefly to their skin before drifting toward darkness, carrying scents of ash and green wood. Sometimes they spoke of places behind them where rivers bent like dark ribbons between forests now far away, or of valleys where wild horses had lifted their heads toward the sound of human steps before turning slowly back into the wind. Voices carried softly through the night air, rising and falling like threads woven into the quietness, until even words seemed shaped from the same stillness, spreading outward beneath stars fixed cold and white above the waiting horizon. The elders watched those stars, as though listening to them, their faces lined by wind and distance, yet carrying a calmness deeper than any map, as if each constellation turning overhead marked not direction but only the passing of time itself. Morning after morning they rose with the same slow care, gathering what little the earth offered along the way, shoulders carrying skins filled with water darkened by silt, hands brushing seeds from grasses heavy with dew beneath the first light. The path narrowed where stone rose along either side, a passage carved by rains long gone, its walls holding the coolness of shadow, even as sunlight pressed down from above in wide, unbroken sheets of warmth and pale blue air. They moved through this place with the silence of those entering sacred ground, feet leaving dust drifting like smoke through narrow spaces where the wind spoke softly in voices shaped by stone, hollowed by centuries of waiting for travelers to pass. Beyond the passage, the land fell open again, this time into a plain carrying the shimmer of heat across its edges, where air bent downward toward earth as though folding itself under the weight of distance and light. A river lay there, not wide but steady, its surface flashing where fish broke briefly through reflections of clouds moving like slow herds across the sky before vanishing again into water, carrying the same silence as the wandering people beside it. They followed the river's curve, until it led them to a place where earth lifted slightly above the floodplain. A rise covered in grass and wind-swept trees, leaning always toward the east, as though pointing toward something beyond the far horizon. Here they stopped, not from weariness, but because something in the air held the stillness of arrival. A quietness settling over branches, over water, over the long grass bending beneath the evening wind, threading softly across the open spaces. They built their fires close together that night, their flames touching upward in brief gestures of gold and smoke, carrying the scent of burning cedar, where someone had found fallen branches near the edge of the river's slow, dark water. Children listened to the wind running its long fingers through the reeds, a sound like voices singing beneath breath, carrying no words, yet shaping a music belonging only to night water and the patient turning of unseen stars above. When sleep came, it came like mist gathering along low ground, curling slowly over blankets and hair until even the fires burned down to embers glowing faintly where moths traced small circles through smoke, drifting like memory into darkness. At dawn, the river gave back the sun piece by piece, first along its shallows, then across the current where the water caught light and scattered it in trembling paths toward the far bank lined by trees, black against widening sky. The wanderers rose again, but slowly now, as though the day itself asked for quietness, their movements carrying none of the distance-driven urgency of earlier paths, but instead the steady rhythm of people listening to something older than footsteps. They carried water from the river, gathered roots from its edges, followed deer tracks through grasses bending with wind, smelling of rain falling somewhere too far away to be seen, yet close enough to shape the air with its coolness. When night returned, the fires burned again, though lower than before. The wanderers sitting close, while the wind circled outward, carrying warmth, ash, and the smell of wood toward distances where even smoke vanished into the dark beyond the flames. The elders told no stories now, but only watched the sparks lifting upward, as though each carried a fragment of memory too small for words. Fragments rising until swallowed by the dark that held everything beyond the reach of firelight. Somewhere beyond sight, the river kept moving, carrying moonlight across its narrow back, its voice blending with wind in a language belonging not to people but to water, air, and earth, speaking to one another through currents, seasons, and endless turning. The wanderers listened without seeking meaning, only hearing the shape of something vast moving through grass, water, and stars above them, something that held their footsteps the way earth holds rivers within its slow, patient hands of stone and soil. When morning came again, the path no longer felt like a thing to be followed, but like a thread already woven through everything they had crossed. Each step now part of a story, carried by earth itself beneath the changing sky. They rose once more, not to leave anything behind, but to keep moving through the same wind, the same grasses, the same sunlight falling across hands, faces, and shadows, walking slowly toward horizons that had always waited without hurry. By nightfall only, their fires marked the land at all small circles of warmth flickering against distances holding the last light above the river where stars gathered, slowly like seeds returning each season to the same silent soil of sky. And so they moved on through wind, grass, water, and firelight, leaving behind no walls, no names, only the fading echo of footsteps through a world carrying them as gently as it carried rivers, clouds, and the turning of stars above.